Welcome back to Bargaining in War. In this lecture, we're going to see how there always exist settlements that both parties prefer to war. To do this, we have to develop some notation to think about the structure of the sort of environment that we're looking at. So let's think about two states, we'll call them A and B, bargaining over some object in dispute. To get the notation all down, let's go ahead and start off by thinking about VA being some value greater than 0, which represents A's valuation of the prize. So this might be how much it values the territory that's in dispute between two actors, could represent how much it values a whole bunch of oil that they plan to extract out of a piece of territory, what have you. Likewise, we're going to have VB, some amount greater than 0, represent B's value of the prize. So this is what they're playing for. The question is, will they play via war or will they play via peace? So let's think about what happens if they fight a war. We're going to make this relatively simple. Lots of exercises that are in the back of Chapter 2 are going to ask you to relax these sorts of assumptions and show that the general results hold under a broader set of circumstances. But for now, let's think about war in a very simple light, where if you fight, one party wins, one party loses, and that's the end of it. The party that wins will capture the entire prize, and the party that loses will capture nothing. So we're going to let P, some value between 0 and 1, represent A's probability of winning a war. At various times throughout these lectures and throughout the book, I will describe P as the distribution of power, where A's probability of victory is A's share of the power. Now, because P is a probability, it is a value that is between 0 and 1. And so if you think about what 1 minus P represents, well, that's B's probability of winning. We're going to assume that there are no draws here. The reason that that's 1 minus P is that the two probabilities must sum to 1 if we're going to have no draws. And so if you add P plus 1 minus P altogether, you get 1 representing 100% of the possible outcomes. The drawback to settling via war is the fact that war is costly. To represent that, let's have a value CA greater than 0 be A's cost of war, and CB greater than 0 be B's cost of war. So these things are positive because if you think about how many people are going to be dying, how many buildings are going to be destroyed, that's some positive quantity, and we're in a moment going to then subtract out that positive quantity from a player's utility. You might think about having a negative cost. However, that's going to get a little bit complicated when we start thinking about a comparative static. If you just set that value of CA being negative, it's better to think about this as some positive value that is weighing how costly it is, so that the larger CA is, the more costly war is, and then we subtract out that CA from A's war payoff. Okay, the last piece of notation is going to be a hypothetical division that we might want to impose between these two states. So we're going to call that division X, where X represents A's share of the settlement. It's a hypothetical settlement. We don't know if we're going to be able to institute one that's going to work for both parties, but we'll see about that in a moment. We're going to make X some value between 0 and 1, so that when we're thinking about this, X is representing the share in terms of a percentage that A is going to be receiving, with B getting the remainder. So then that means 1 minus X is capturing B's share of that hypothetical settlement. Okay, so now that we have all of the notation down on the board, let's think about the value for accepting a settlement versus the value for fighting a war. Let's start with A. So when does A prefer a settlement? Okay, well, we have up here that A's share of a settlement is going to be X. That's a percentage share of the good. And so if it's receiving X in a settlement, we're going to be multiplying that by A's value of the prize, which is VA. So it's getting X percentage of the total value of which is VA. That's what happens if it settles. If it fights a war, then think about how we went through this the last time when we were up here thinking about these probabilities of victory. With probability P, A wins. And if it wins, it gets to capture 100% of the entire value VA. If it loses, then it's going to get none of that entire value of VA. And regardless, win or lose, we have the costs of war being CA, which we're going to subtract out. You'll notice here that we're not assuming any particular functional form about these costs for war. We might think in practice, for example, if A is more likely to win, maybe that it's not going to be paying the cost of war as much. That could be a relationship that you impose on the structure of this, but in fact, we can show a more general result if we don't assume that, and we just say that the cost of war is positive and leave it at that. Notice again that we're subtracting out that positive cost for war, which means that the way that A internalizes this is bad. It does not like having high costs, it likes having smaller costs. Okay, so what we have here then is when A is going to be happy to accept a settlement. A is going to be happy to accept a settlement as long as what it's getting from the settlement is at least as good as what it's getting for war. We can do a little bit of simplifying here, so let's just go ahead and get rid of all of that unnecessary 1 and multiplication. That 0 entirely cancels out. So we have a little bit simpler of a statement right there of A being happy as long as X times VA is greater than or equal to P times VA minus CA. And if we're thinking about the actual settlement, the settlement itself is X. So if we're trying to figure out what settlements are going to work for both parties, we should be finishing this inequality in terms of X. So we need to divide everything by VA. And if we do that, we get X has to be greater than P minus CA divided by VA. Okay, good. Well, we can do the same thing for the other player, state B. So when does B prefer a settlement? If we go back up here, we see that B's share of a settlement is 1 minus X. And it is thinking of the value of the prize as VB. So it's going to get 1 minus X percentage of VB if it were to accept a deal. So that means that we have this being B's total payoff for accepting a deal. Now let's think about what B's payoff is for fighting a war. Well, with probability P, we have A winning. And if A is winning, that means A is taking the entire prize and B is getting nothing. So that means that we have, as the first part of this payoff for war, P times 0, because A is winning and B is getting none of that value VB in that case. And then with probability 1 minus P, we have B now emerging victorious, which means it will capture 100% of the prize, which it values at VB. And regardless, it has to pay a cost for war. So CB is going to be subtracted out at the very end. So you'll notice that B is happy as long as what it's receiving from the settlement is at least as large as what it's getting from the right side of the inequality. Well, like before, we can do some simplifying here. Let's just go ahead and multiply everything out on the right-hand side. So that 0 cancels everything there. We have a 1 and a 1 minus P times a VB, and we subtract out a CB. Excellent. What more do we have here? Well, we can multiply out the VB on both of these. So VB minus PVB minus CB. And then you can see that these VBs cancel. So we can move the X over here. So we want to solve for X, and that'll get rid of the negative if we do that. PVB plus CB. So we're just flip-flopping everything on the other sides so that everything is becoming positive. And now to solve for x, we just should divide off VB from both sides. So we get x less than or equal to P plus CB over VB. So we have two constraints for getting a settlement to work. We have from here, B requiring that x is sufficiently small, P plus CB divided by VB. And for the other one coming from up here, we have x has to be greater than or equal to P minus CA over VA. So if we think about what's going on with both of these conditions, the one on the left is coming from B. This is what B needs to be satisfied. Think about what x represents. X represents A's share of the good. So for B to be satisfied, A can't get too much. Because if A is getting too much, then B is not getting enough, and B prefers fighting a war. And what defines too much in this case is P plus CB divided by VB. Meanwhile, the second of our inequalities is reflecting what A needs. X again represents A's share of the good, and so A needs a sufficiently large share of the good to be satisfied, and that's why X has to be greater than or equal to P minus CA over VA. One more time, we just need both of these things to be satisfied for us to get a deal done. So let's figure out if we can find a value of X such that X is simultaneously less than or equal to P plus CB over VB, and that X value is greater than P minus CA over VA. If this inequality holds, then we can get a deal that is satisfactory to both parties. Well, to answer if such X values exist, really all we should be doing is erasing that middleman of X and asking ourselves whether P plus CB over VB is a larger value than P minus CA over VA. If that's the case, then there are values that are going to fall in between those two that we can select for X that will be mutually satisfactory. Well, you'll notice here that the P's cancel off, and if we add the cost to the other side, we get CA over VA plus CB over VB is greater than or equal to 0. If that statement is true, then we can find values of X that are mutually satisfactory. We can appease both parties and avoid war. Well, does that inequality hold? As it turns out, the answer is yes. If we go way back up here, what do we see? CA is a positive value, CB is a positive value, and if we go further back up, VA is a positive value, and VB is a positive value. So, if you take two positive values, everything here is positive. You take two positive values and have some sort of multiplication or division between them, you're left with a positive value. So this thing is positive. And if you do the same thing with this, same story. This is positive. So we're adding two positive numbers together, which of course are greater than or equal to 0. In fact, they're strictly greater than 0. So this is true. What we have just shown is that there always exist settlements that are mutually preferable to war. Just like that. Pretty easy. But the implications are actually fairly deep, and that's what we're going to be exploring through this entire course. What does this result mean, and why is it that we still have states fighting some of the time anyway? We're going to go deeper into this proof, so if there's some sort of conceptual issue with what's going on, why this works, hopefully by the next few lectures you'll have a better idea of what's going on. Hope you enjoyed this, and hope to see you next time. Take care. Welcome back to Bargaining in War. This lecture is on the ultimatum game for crisis bargaining. In past lectures, we've explored whether there exist settlements that both parties prefer to war. What we haven't yet done is explore which settlement the states will actually choose, nor have we used any sort of game theoretical modeling to help us answer that question. This is going to be a problem for us in the long term. Crisis bargaining theorists care a lot about how changing the inputs of a strategic scenario affect its outputs. For example, how does increasing one state's power or decreasing the cost of war affect the probability of war versus peace? At its core, that's a question of comparative statics. But to take a comparative static, the first step is always to solve for the equilibrium of a game. Yet, we cannot solve for the equilibrium of a game until we have a game in the first place. And that's what the ultimatum game is going to do for us. There are two reasons why we're studying the ultimatum game and not some sort of other bargaining protocol. First, if you take a random article from the crisis bargaining literature, more likely than not, the author is going to be using the ultimatum game to explore the phenomenon of interest. Thus, if we are going to look at any one bargaining protocol, it must be the ultimatum game. The second is more theoretically justified. I don't want to go too far into this because it is getting pretty deep into the literature, but imagine that you were involved in a crisis bargaining scenario and you got to choose how to bargain over the particular good at stake. Well, we have some results in the literature that show that it would be optimal for you to choose to make an ultimatum. In other words, say to your opponent, I am going to take this much, you can take the remainder, and if you don't like that, then you must fight me. You can think about how that might be theoretically justified by if you have control of the strip of territory already, the way that you might go about negotiating with your opponent is to retreat to a particular point and then tell your opponent, this is the new border. If you don't like it, let's fight a war. And now that I've previewed the substantive idea behind an ultimatum game, let's now formalize that down into a model and solve for its equilibrium. The ultimatum game is just a two-step process. First, state A will make a demand. And like normal, you can think about this as a percentage of the good that is going to A. So X is a quantity that is between 0 and 1. B observes A's decision and then accepts or rejects it. And that's the end of the game. Very simple, very straightforward. The payoffs are going to follow from what we've learned about previously. We're not changing anything there. So if B accepts, A's share of the division is X, so that's its payoff. And B gets the remainder, so B's payoff is going to be 1 minus X. If B rejects, we get our normal war payoffs. So A will receive P minus CA, and B will receive 1 minus P minus CB. How do we solve this? Well, just like any sort of complete information game that has multiple steps, if we can start at the bottom, that's where we should start. We should try to apply backward induction as far as we can. So for here, that means looking at B's accept and reject decision, and to figure out when B prefers to accept versus when it prefers to reject. Let's start with the accept case. B earns 1 minus X if it agrees to a deal, and it gets 1 minus P minus CB if it rejects. So solving for X, which is ultimately what A is going to be demanding, if X is less than P plus CB, then that implies that B accepts. It must accept. Well, by analogous argument, if X is greater than P plus CB, now A is demanding too much, and so B rejects. And likewise, when X is exactly equal to P plus CB, then we have B being indifferent. For the purposes of this lecture, let's imagine that B accepts with certainty when it's indifferent. In the next lecture, we'll look at this a little bit more in depth and show that, in fact, there are no other equilibria where B is going to be doing anything else. So in any equilibrium, it must be the case that B is accepting when indifferent. And again, we'll talk more about that later on in the next lecture. For now, just go with this. Let's imagine that this is B's decision and how it's going to respond to any given demand from A. Well, once we're armed with that knowledge through backward induction, we just go up to A's demand and figure out which demand is going to optimize A's payoff. And that will be the demand that A ultimately implements. Well, let's think about this as a number line. We're varying the value of x, and there's a single cut point of p plus cb. If x is larger than that amount, then we have b reject. And if x is less than or equal to that amount, we have b accept. So all I am doing is plotting this information on a number line. Now let's use this visualization to figure out what is A's optimal demand. Well, first let's note that any demand in this region is going to be rejected. It doesn't matter which. Every one of those is rejected, and A gets the same payoff for that scenario, which is P minus CA. It gets its war payoff from up here. Okay? Well, then the other thing that we need to look at is this range of offers that B is going to accept. And once we figure out which of those demands that A can make that maximizes its utility within this accept region, we need to then compare the utility for making that demand to making a demand that B would reject, thereby giving A payoff of P minus CA, and see which of those two options is better. Well, it turns out there's going to only be a single demand that could possibly be optimal if A wants to get B to accept. Let's think about some demand that is lower than the cut point. Say right here. Imagine we have X as the demand. Well, B accepts, and so A's utility for that is just X. But compare that to some demand slightly larger, by an epsilon quantity more. This is still within the region that B accepts, so A's utility is still going to be whatever it demanded. The difference, of course, is that now it's getting additional epsilon because it's demanding slightly more. So there is no reason why you would only demand X when you could demand X plus epsilon. But that's not going to be optimal either, because you could always demand epsilon more and still get B to accept and get more for yourself. But that logic applies further and further on, further and further and further on, until you can't get any further. Namely, if A is going to demand P plus CB, if it tries demanding anything else, extra, B is going to switch from accepting to rejecting. So none of these demands down here can possibly be optimal for A, because demanding this quantity is going to be better for it. There's always some slightly larger demand that A is going to be better off by making. So what that means is that the question really just boils down to two options. Does A want to demand P plus CB and keep P plus CB for itself? Or does it want to make any sort of unacceptable demand, have B reject it, and then get its war payoff of P minus CA? Well, if that's the case, all we need to do is make a simple calculation of whether A prefers the amount where it's getting P plus CB or it gets P minus CA. And very clearly, we have an answer. Obviously, P plus CB is better than P minus CA. In fact, if you just rearrange this, the end of the proof is going to look pretty similar to what we have seen previously. So you'll see that A prefers making that optimal demand that is going to be acceptable of P plus CB, as long as CA plus CB is greater than 0. In other words, as long as war is inefficient. It is not a coincidence that this is matching the previous ends of proofs that we have seen. If A is going to fight a war, that is costly. It doesn't benefit anyone. And by being the state that is able to make the proposal, A can make B just indifferent between accepting and rejecting, which means it gets to save its costs for war by not having to fight, and extract B's cost of war. A makes out like a bandit, so there is no way that A is going to intentionally sabotage negotiations. If this isn't clear, let's just do a single graph of what's going on with A's payoff, and that might clarify what's going on in A's decision. So here on our x-axis, we actually have X, the demand being made, and on our y-axis, we have A's utility as a function of X. And we have this critical cut point of P plus CB. So what we see is that anything to the left of P plus CB is going to be accepted, and A's utility is just equal to the size of the demand. So that increases linearly. And if it makes that demand at the cut point, it receives a value of P plus CB. Meanwhile, if it chooses anything greater than P plus CB, then B rejects. And so A's utility is going to be a flat value of P minus CA. So again, you'll notice here, because we have assumed that B is going to accept when indifferent right here, that B is giving A this quantity up here when it is having the demand of P plus CB, and we're not having this rejection payoff down here instead. Well, if you're A, your decision process really is just looking at this figure and deciding what is the X associated with my highest utility. And it doesn't take very long for A to realize that that demand that's best for it is P plus CB. End of story. Done. So to recap, in the ultimatum game, A demands X equal to P plus CB. And what does B do? Well, B accepts X less than or equal to P plus CB and rejects X greater than P plus CB. This is our subgame perfect equilibrium of the ultimatum game. That's it. That's all there is to it. In the next lecture, we'll deconstruct this assumption about B accepting when indifferent and see why, in fact, this equilibrium that we have described for the ultimatum game right here is, in fact, the only equilibrium. Hope you enjoyed this and hope to see you next time. Take care.
Hi, I'm William Spaniel. Let's learn about international relations. Today's topic is preemptive war. I cover this in Chapter 6 of The Rationality of War. Check the video description for more information about that. Now, the big question that we're interested in addressing today is, how do first strike advantages lead to war? Remember that preventive war and preemptive war are distinctly different here. In preventive war, we were talking about power shifting over the course of time, and in preemptive war, we are talking about first strike advantages. Now recall back that, as always, as long as the distribution of power is stable and there are costs of fighting, then there exists a bargaining range, and any settlement within that bargaining range is mutually preferable to war. But we've implicitly assumed here that this probability of A's victory is PA, is not changing in who declares war. It doesn't matter who declares war. A is always winning with probability PA, and B is always winning with probability 1 minus PA. But that's a critical assumption to the model. What if we change that? What if we made the probability of victory no longer constant of who starts the war? So we're going to make first strike advantages exist. There's an element of surprise here, and if I decide to fight you before you decide to fight me, then I get to dictate where we're going to fight. So there's some distinct advantages here to striking first, and it's possible that this may cause our peaceful result to break down, and thus giving us another explanation or another rationalist explanation for war. So as it turns out, we will get a new rationalist explanation for war here, as long as the first strike advantages are sufficiently large. And to see this, we're going to go back to the days when we were talking about the algebraic model, and we're going to work with that here. So the model is going to look like this. We're going to suppose that the states must choose whether to preempt or bargain before they actually sit down at the bargaining table. So if you're a state, you get to decide, all right, do I want to talk things out with my opponent, or do I just want to go ahead and start a fight right now? If I'm starting a fight right now, then I'm preempting. If I'm actually sitting down at the bargaining table, then I'm bargaining. So if both preempt or both bargain, and bargaining fails, then A is still winning with probability PA. So there's no advantage if we both attack at the same time, whether it's because bargaining broke down or because we never even tried bargaining. However, if A preempts, if A tries to launch a first strike against B and B is trying to bargain and so they're not prepared for this first strike, then the states will fight a war, and A is now going to win with probability PA plus delta PA, where this delta PA represents the additional probability of victory that A gets from striking first. And in contrast, B is now going to win with probability 1 minus PA plus CB if B preempts and A bargains. So whoever is striking first when the other one is bargaining is gaining this inherent advantage, this delta factor, this value of delta, which represents the first strike advantage. And war is still going to be costly, and to keep things simple, we're going to make it just as costly as in a regular war, so CA and CB are going to remain constant regardless of who starts the war or when the war actually begins. All right. So the model in question here is, suppose that X is the outcome of bargaining. Suppose that if we do sit down at the bargaining table, then X will be the outcome of the negotiations, where state A is receiving X of the good and state B is receiving 1 minus X of the good. Then does there exist in X such that the states individually prefer the bargained outcome to preemption. So let's look at this dilemma from both states' perspectives, starting with A. Assume that the other guy is going to bargain here. So assume that B is going to sit down at the bargaining table and A knows that. Would A want to sit down at the bargaining table in response to knowing that B is going to sit down at the bargaining table? Well, if A preempts, its expected utility is PA minus CA plus delta A. So this is the probability of victory under normal circumstances plus the first strike advantage minus the costs of fighting CA. That's what the state A will receive if it decides to launch a surprise attack against B. In contrast, we've assumed that X is the outcome of the bargaining game if they both sit down on the bargaining table. So A will receive X if they both sit down at the table. All right. So that means bargaining is acceptable to A if the amount that A will receive at the bargaining table, X, is greater than or equal to its value for preemption, PA minus CA minus delta A. It's just these two things combined together. So that's A's dilemma. A is going to be willing to sit down at a bargaining table if that holds. What about B? Well, B's dilemma, again, we're going to assume that the other guy, in this case A, is going to be sitting down at the bargaining table. And so the expected utility for B, if it launches a surprise attack, is 1 minus PA. That's the probability that B would win a war under normal circumstances, plus the additional probability of victory, the first strike advantage delta, minus the costs of fighting for B, CB. So that's B's expected utility for fighting. Now, if B were to bargain instead, to forego the first strike advantage, then when they sit down at the bargaining table, B will get 1 minus X. That's the remainder of the amount that A is getting. Remember, A gets X and B gets the remainder, or 1 minus X. That's essentially 100% of the good minus A's percentage of the good. So that means bargaining is acceptable if we just put these two things together. One is this, at least as good as that. Well, that's when 1 minus X is greater than or equal to 1 minus PA minus CB plus delta CB. Again, it's just coming from these two things right here. And so if we solve for X, as long as X is less than or equal to PA plus CB minus delta B, then B is willing to bargain. Essentially, A can receive no more than that amount for B to be happy with the remainder. All right, so now we just combine those last two slides together. A mutually acceptable bargain exists if this holds. If PA minus CA plus delta A is less than or equal to X, which is less than or equal to PA plus CB minus CB. So that just came from the last two slides where we got here and here. If we combine those two things together, then we get this set of inequalities. And such an X will exist, such a bargain will exist as long as this is less than or equal to this. So we're essentially just cut out the X from the set of inequalities to leave us with one inequality. And now we can do some simplifying here because we have a PA on both sides. And so we get, as long as the delta A plus the delta B is less than or equal to the costs of A plus the costs of B, then a mutually preferable bargain does in fact exist. And to turn that into English here, the first strike advantages, if the first strike advantages are smaller than the costs of fighting, then a mutually acceptable bargain exists. So remember that delta A is A's first strike advantage, delta B is B's first strike advantage. If you sum those first strike advantages together and they're less than or equal to the costs of fighting, the sum costs of fighting, then a mutually preferable bargain exists. Now to see this visually, again, we're going to refer back to the old school bargaining range, the simplified version that we talked about in the geometric model. Now we need to add some additional variables here. Specifically, we need to add each side's first strike advantage. So first, let's look at A's first strike advantage. So the value of A's first strike advantage I'm making here is sized delta A, and it's going to be the length of this blue line. So we're adding this amount to A's probability of victory. So if you take this and you add that to it, that shifts this probability of victory if A is preempting over to here. And after you subtract for the costs of fighting, then we get to here. So that's PA plus delta A minus CA. This red line represents how much A expects to receive if it preempts, which is a lot more than it would expect to get under a war in normal circumstances, which is this amount right here. In fact, it's delta A more. That's how much it increases by, is the first strike advantage. All right, so basically what's going on here is if A is going to be willing to sit down at the bargaining table, it has to receive this much, at least this much through bargaining. Now, let's add in B's first strike advantage. So suppose B has a first strike advantage. Again, we're going to make it sized delta B, and that's going to be the size of the blue line. So that's going to shift the probability of victory for B closer to A's capital. So that means we have to move the probability of victory down to represent the fact that this is better for the side that has the capital over here, state B. So that means we're moving this value here, PA, minus delta CB. So we're moving it over. and then we are adding the costs back. So essentially what's going on is this line is moving to here, and then this line is moving to here. So we're just moving things, we're shifting both of these values, PA and PA plus CB, over to the left by a value delta B, which is B's first strike advantage, or the size of this blue line here. So that means B's reservation value for war is the size of this red line. If B is going to be willing to sit down on the bargaining table, then it must receive at least this amount out of the bargain. Now, if we get rid of all of the extraneous information here and we just look at how much each side needs to receive to be willing to sit down on the bargaining table, we're going to see that there's a problem. So if you remember, this line right here is the amount that A needs to receive. This line right here is the amount that B needs to receive. The entire length of the slide from here to here is the value of all the goods. It's 100% of the goods from here to here. And we see that the sum of this and this extends greater than the length of the slide, right? Because there's some overlap here. That means there is no bargaining range. It means that we need to have more goods than exist in order to be able to satisfy both sides. We need more than 100% of the goods to be able to buy off both parties simultaneously. Obviously, we can't do that, and so that means the states are going to be fighting. And note that when the states fight, we still have inefficiency, because now the first strike advantages are negated. Both sides are fighting a war just as they had under normal circumstances. So A is winning with probability PA, but A is paying this cost CA, so it's receiving this amount, the value of this red line. B is paying its costs CB, and so it's getting that value, the value of that red line. And we see that there's some deadweight loss here. Both sides are paying the costs, but it's going to neither side. So this is bad for the world, this is bad for the system, because there do exist bargains that are mutually preferable to war. It's just that we can't hold on to them, we can't hold or credibly commit to them over the course of time, because as soon as we decide that one side is going to sit down at the bargaining table, the other side has incentive to go ahead and launch a first strike and take advantage of that fact. So that's a bad outcome from both parties, and yet nevertheless, you have to live with it because the alternatives just won't work out over time. All right, the last remaining question to address here is whether this is actually a realistic explanation for war. It certainly works in theory, but does it actually occur in reality? After all, wars tend to be really, really costly. And remember, in order for war to be rational here, the first strike advantages have to outweigh the costs. So the question that remains is, empirically speaking, do first strike advantages really outweigh the costs? And the answer that the literature sort of has come to a conclusion here is that the answer is probably not. It seems that this isn't a really good explanation for war if we're only looking at first strike advantages, that first strike advantages tend not to be enough to cause war on their own, but the presence of first strike advantages shrinks the bargaining range regardless. So even if the bargaining range, or rather, even if the first strike advantages aren't particularly large, but they still exist, then the presence of those first strike advantages shrinks the bargaining range, which in turn makes it easier for other rationalist explanations for war to cause problems. So the idea of preventive war, or information problems, or issue indivisibilities, those things can flare up more often as long as there are first strike advantages, even if the first strike advantages alone are not sufficient for war. So that is preemptive war in a nutshell. It's also this idea of unitary actor explanations for war in a nutshell, that we've gone through all of those lectures now, and we now have a good understanding of how bargaining relates to war, and how if states are unitary actors, how even if they are unbiased, they have unbiased leaders that aren't self-motivated, that these guys can still find reasons to fight each other, even in the presence of even in the lack of a presence of any selfish purpose from these leaders. So that takes care of that. And it takes care of the unit. We're done with that unit. And starting in the next video, we will look at the other end of the cooperative versus non-cooperative spectrum. So in these videos, we've been looking at times when states have competing preferences and don't really want to work with each other, but only have incentive to work with each other because, well, war is costly and they want to avoid it. In contrast, in the next unit, we're going to be looking at trade, where states really do have a lot of incentive to work together, and these strictly competitive aspects don't particularly work out nearly as well, and so there's really a lot more reason to be optimistic about cooperation when we look at trade. So I hope you enjoyed this unit on the rationality of war. I do encourage you to check out that book, because that book will have all of these examples in much greater detail and a whole lot more information, so it's pretty cheap and I think a good investment in both your terms of cost and in your time. And until next time, take care, and I will see you in the next video on trade. Bye.
Hi, I'm William Spaniel. Let's learn about international relations. Today's topic is understanding war, and the big question is, well, how do we understand war? We spent the last few lectures developing a solid foundation of the bargaining model of war, and now that you have that,
it's going to be easier to see why you need it to be able to explain war, to predict war, and to understand war. To recap, the bargaining model of war tells us that for war to occur between unitary actor states, one of the following things must exist. You need to have incomplete information and incentives to misrepresent, or you need to have shifting power, which leads to preventive war and preemptive war, or you need to have issue indivisibility, although I note here that we don't really like that explanation because you can always come up with some sort of side payment to resolve the indivisibility problem. Or I'm not going to discount the fact that there might be some other mechanism that causes bargaining failure that we've yet to fully identify. But at least for now, where we are in international relations, in the scholarly pursuit of international relations, we only have those top three mechanisms, and of those top three mechanisms, we only think that the top two, incomplete information and incentives to misrepresent, as well as shifting power, are actually helping us explain why wars occur. Now, just to be very explicit about what this slide is saying, is you need to have one of these mechanisms in order for war to occur. If you do not have one of these mechanisms, then you do not get war occurring in any interaction between two unitary actor states. And that might seem trivial and might seem unimportant, but hold on for 1 second. Let's think about why wars occur. If you go into a history textbook, for example, open up the chapter on the American Revolution. What caused the American Revolution to occur? Well, the textbook answer you commonly get is taxation without representation. Brits were taxing American colonies, and American colonials did not have, at least they felt, adequate representation to justify that taxation. If you look at the common textbook example or textbook explanation for the American Civil War, you'll see that it was slavery that caused the American Civil War. It was this rivalry between the North and the South over the slavery and the fate of slavery in the United States, which caused the American Civil War to occur. And if you look at the textbook explanation, one of the textbook explanations at least, of World War I, it was colonial ambitions. Countries that were late to the colonial game wanted to make up for this. They wanted to gain their own colonies, and the way that they sought to do this was to fight a war against current colonial powers. Now, just to be clear, there are a bunch of different explanations for these wars on your screen and a bunch of different explanations for other wars that are not on your screen. But the common textbook explanations that you get from historians is overlooking one critical factor. Why not bargain? None of those explanations that I just gave you are sufficient for war. And that's because they do not explain why the parties could not reach a mutually preferable bargain. War is costly after all, and those costs incentivize the parties to reach a mutually preferable deal that leaves both parties better off than if they had fought a war. And in fact, it's these costs of war that explain why peace prevailed up until the wars began. States don't just immediately jump into fighting. They try to negotiate solutions, and they try to work through their problems without reaching wars because these wars are so darn costly. But because you're not explaining why bargaining failed here, you're not actually explaining fully why the war occurred. You do not have a sufficient explanation for war, a sufficient cause for war. So overall, the recipe for war is twofold. You need two things for war to occur. You need grievance, which is the thing that textbooks normally focus on, like taxation without representation, slavery, territorial ambitions, and so forth. And you also need a bargaining problem, the things that we've been focusing on in this unit, like incomplete information and shifting power. With only one of these things, you do not get conflict. Wars do not occur with only one of these things. If you have grievances between two parties, you should be expecting them to negotiate a solution. If you have some sort of bargaining problem between two parties, like incomplete information and shifting power, but no grievance, then you have no reason for them to fight. It's the interaction of these two things. These two things are jointly sufficient for war, where having a grievance, having a reason to be upset at someone else, and also having something that interferes with bargaining, that is what causes wars to occur. Without both of these things, with only one of these things, you do not get war. You need to have both of these things around in order for you to get war to occur. And as a result, your high school history classes were really lacking here because they were always focusing on the grievance part and they were never focusing on the bargaining problem. All right, so where does that take us? Why do we care about these bargaining problems so much? Well, our research tends to focus on bargaining problems and not grievances, and that's not without good reason or without good justification.
The reason that we focus on these bargaining problems and we tend not to focus on the grievances so much is that, as far as we know, there are only two types of bargaining problems, the shifting power and the incomplete information stories, and, not really that issue in divisibility, and, maybe there's something else out there, maybe not, but for now, we just have two different sources of bargaining problem to address. In contrast, there are way too many types of grievances to count. If you look at any explanation for any war and then cross-reference it with another grievance explanation for war, a different war, you're going to be getting, on average, very disparate things. It's not very common for the same grievance to cause a war in one place and then cause a war in another place. So the types of grievances that you can be looking at is a very, very long list. In contrast, the types of bargaining problems that cause war, again, as far as we know, really only two of them. And so if we're interested in understanding why wars occur and trying to stop wars from happening in the future, we need to be looking at things that recur over time. And the things that recur over time are these bargaining problems precisely because there are only two of them. And moreover, it's much easier to convince parties to negotiate solutions, to figure out ways of resolving these sorts of bargaining problems, how to have them transmit information to one another to resolve incomplete information, or how to halt the progress of shifting power to avoid those bargaining problems and sparking war. It's much more difficult, in contrast, to convince two sides that have been long aggravated with one another to sit down and sing kumbaya with one another. It's much easier to convince parties to bargain than it is to have them just lay down all of their burdens and stop having any grievances with one another. And that's why we tend to focus on these sorts of bargaining problems. So that's understanding war for you. Hope you enjoyed this, and I hope to see you next time. Take care. Welcome back to Game Theory 101. I'm William Spaniel. Today we're asking whether more information is always better. And to spoil that question, the answer is yes, at least in a decision-theoretic context. Remember, in game theory, we have multiple agents playing an interaction where their payoffs are strategically interdependent. So what I do affects my payoff and your payoff, and what you do affects your payoff and my payoff. Decision theory is different. Decision theory only involves a single actor taking an action or multiple actions that leads to payoffs, either for that individual or for that individual and others. The bottom line here is that's only a single person involved in the decision making. The reason that when there's just a single person involved in decision making, that more information is always better for that individual is because that individual can always ignore the information that he or she receives. So if for some strange reason, acting on the information that was given to you would hurt your payoff, you would simply ignore it. So one way to think about this theorem is that it is the Willie hears ya, Willie don't care theorem. Again, if you get a piece of information when you're playing a game by yourself, you can always ignore that information if it were to harm you. This is not going to carry over into the game theoretical context. When we have multiple agents playing a game, we're going to see that, in fact, more information can harm the individual that has that information. And to see this, let's think about the following game. We're going to start with less information. We're going to see what the payoffs can be for this game, and then we're going to see what's going to happen when we give a player more information. So let's start with the situation where there's less information available to a player. We have player one choosing whether to play or not, a simple binary decision. If he doesn't play, if he quits, then everyone gets a flat payoff of 1. Simultaneously, player 2 has 3 actions to choose from. She can pick heads, she can pick tails, or she can pass. If player 1 didn't quit and player 2 passed, both players receive a payoff of 2. If player 1 didn't quit and player 2 chooses heads or tails, then we flip a coin. And if player 2 called it correctly, then she'll receive 3 and player 1 will receive -3. And if she's wrong, then player 1 will receive 3 and she'll receive -3. So you should notice that if we have a situation where they actually play the game and player 1 chooses, or rather player 2 chooses heads or tails, that the expected value for both players under those circumstances is 0. Because half of the time the individual is going to win and half of the time the individual is going to lose. So 3 and -3 averages out to a flat 0. So this game looks like this, where again, if player 1 quits, flat 1 for everyone. If player 1 plays and player 2 passes, both players receive a payoff of 2. And because we worked out the expected value for play and heads, as well as play and tails, zeros across the board there. We can solve this game with Nash equilibrium because no player has any sort of informational knowledge that the other player doesn't have, because that coin is flipped afterwards, so no one knows what's going on there. And one thing you can note is that there is an efficient Nash equilibrium. If player 1 plays and player 2 passes, both players receive their highest possible payoff, so that's a Nash equilibrium. There are other equilibria here. You can check that on your own. If you want to pause the video now to do that, you may. But that's not the important piece of information. The important piece of information here is that when no one is informed about the coin flip, we get a payoff of 2 for both players. So this is what we want to compare the next situation to. And the next situation is going to bestow one of these players more information. In fact, we're going to give player 2 knowledge of the coin flip. So rather than player 2 not knowing what the coin flip is going to be when she chooses heads or tails, she'll see the result of the coin flip privately. So she knows this information and player 1 doesn't know this information. So this is information that's private to player 2. The payoffs work exactly alike as before. It's just now that player 2 is essentially cheating and she knows what the answer is to that coin flip. Now we switch over into a world of Bayesian-Nash equilibrium because we have 2 different types of player 2. We have a heads type, which is occurring with probability 1/2, where that coin has been revealed to be heads. And so she knows that if she chooses heads after player 1 plays, that she gets a payoff of 3, whereas if she were to choose tails, she would receive a payoff of -3. And there's another type of player 2, of course, the tails type. And this is just flip-flopping those payoffs from the play heads and the play tails outcomes. The question we need to ask now is whether player 1 can choose play with positive probability. And the reason we're asking this question is because if it's not possible for player 1 to choose play with positive probability, that means he's quitting with certainty. And if he's quitting with certainty, then both players receive a payoff of 1. Which would mean that player 2 is harmed by the information that she is given. She gets more information, she has an informational advantage, and yet somehow, some way, instead of receiving a payoff of 2, she drops down to a payoff of 1. And we're going to see that the answer to this question is no. Player 1 cannot choose play with positive probability, so player 2 will in fact be harmed by the information that she has received. So let's think about why it cannot be the case for player 1 to choose play with positive probability. Imagine that player 1 were to do that. What's player 2's best response? Well, obviously, if player 1 is playing some of the time, player 2 should be choosing the correct side of the coin. And she knows what the answer is, of course, because she's been given that information ahead of time. Now, there's a slight trip up here because this is ruling out any sort of positive probability of choosing play at all. But the reason that this logic works, even though player 1 might be quitting some of the time, is because if we look back at the payoff matrix, this is again for the tails type, but it doesn't matter whether it's the heads type or the tails type. If player 1 quits, player 2 gets a payoff of 1 guaranteed. So it doesn't matter what strategy she uses under those circumstances, which means if player 1 is playing play with positive probability, then her best response is going to be whatever is the best response to play, regardless of how small of a chance that it is that player 1 is choosing play. So we know that player 2 has to choose the correct side of the coin if player 1 is going to choose play with positive probability. But now let's think about whether player 1 would actually want to play with positive probability under those circumstances. Well, if he's choosing play with positive probability, then he's receiving a -3 that portion of the time, and he'll receive a payoff of 1 from quitting the remainder of the time. But this means that some portion of the time he's getting a very bad payoff. He's getting that -3 because player 2 knows what side of the coin to call because she has seen the result of the coin flip. Well, that means he could profitably deviate by choosing to quit. If he chooses to quit, he gets a payoff of 1 guaranteed, and that's going to be better than a combination of -3 and 1. So it can't be the case that player 1 chooses play with positive probability. There are no Bayesian-Nash equilibria in which that occurs, because we have shown that there's a profitable deviation under those circumstances. So we have shown exactly what strategy player 1 must choose in any Bayesian-Nash equilibrium of this game. He must choose quit. Now, what player 2 does, you could figure that out on your own if you really wanted to. You could look back, pause the video, and figure that out if you'd like. But it doesn't matter for the purposes of answering our original question of whether more information is always better. We can stop here and conclude that more information is not always better because we know what player 2's payoff is for this game. It's a payoff of 1. So without knowledge of the coin flip, player 2 receives a payoff of 2, and with knowledge of the coin flip, she receives a payoff of 1. Her payoff has diminished. Let's think about why this is the case to conclude here. We have improved player 2's knowledge, but the issue is that player 2 now faces a credible commitment problem. She can't credibly commit not to act on the information given to her. That is, to play heads when the coin says heads, or play tails when the coin says tails. And so as a result, she cannot credibly commit to play pass. And it's only under the circumstances where she's playing pass would player 1 be willing to choose play instead of quit, so they can reach that payoff of 2 for both players rather than the payoff of 1. So while player 2 is enriched with more information, it's triggering a commitment problem, and we know that commitment problems can lead to bad outcomes for players, and that's exactly what's going on here. So more information isn't always bad. In fact, if you take a random game, it's a very good chance that more information will help out whoever is receiving that information. But in the context of this one particular game, it is not better, which means that we can't have any sort of broad generalizations about whether information is good or not for players. We have to look at it from game to game. All right, that wraps up this lecture. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope to see you next time. Take care.